What's going on, everyone? My name is Kodomore and welcome to episode 12 of the New Beginner Java Game Programming Tutorial Series. In this tutorial, we're going to do one more quick thing with states and then talk about how our player is going to be made. So real quickly, let's go over states. So at the end of the last tutorial, I asked you guys to go out and create a few more states other than just the game state. Now I'm hoping that most of you did it. Whether you created one or not, I'm going to go ahead and show you how you should have created them to make sure you did it properly, and I'm going to show you guys how we're going to deal with states for right now since we're still in the development process of our game. So off screen, I went ahead and I created a menu state class, and remember, every state you have should extend state. That means you have to have a tick and a render method, and then I just threw in a constructor. That's optional, we don't need it for right now, but I like to have it. So I have this menu state class. That's going to be the main menu of our game. So in your main game class, you're going to want to initialize or declare every state that you have. So a private state, menu state for me. So now I have a game state and a menu state. Down in our init method here, where we initialize our game state, you're going to initialize all your other states. So menu state equals a new menu state for me, like so. Now make sure when you set your state, you're setting it only to the game state. All the code that we're going to be doing in this tutorial and for a couple of tutorials is only going to be in the game state. We're not going to touch our menu state or anything like that. We're just going to be programming the game part of our game since we currently don't have enough knowledge to program a menu of our game as of now. So go ahead, create a few state classes like a menu state, a game state, maybe a setting state. Declare them at the top of your game class, initialize them in your init method, but just set your state to the game state, because we're just going to begin programming our game instead of doing boring menus to start with. Alright, so hopefully if you run your game state should be ticking and rendering. You can do that by checking and drawing an image in your game state. I'm drawing a dirt image, so if I run my program, we get an image of a dirt on the screen. I'm going to delete that piece of test code, and we can finally get into what we're going to be programming in today's tutorial. Like I mentioned before, we're going to begin programming the player today. Now before we begin programming the player, we have to learn a few more things and map out exactly how we're going to do this, because it's a tiny bit more complicated than you may think if we want to do it properly. So we're going to do a few diagrams. So we are going to begin by talking about entities. Now what is an entity? Now an entity for our purposes is going to be absolutely anything in our game. So anything in our game that is not a tile. So anything in our game that isn't a tile, anything that is not a grass tile or a dirt tile or a tree tile is going to be classified as an entity. This means that every single item in our game is going to be an entity. It means that every single enemy in our game, or NPC, is also going to be an entity. This also means that our player itself is going to be an entity. So all three of these things, and many more that I haven't mentioned, all have something in common. They're all entities. So what we are going to do is we are going to implement an entity-based system in our game. This means we are going to create a bunch of series of classes that all represent entities, and you're going to see what I mean right now. So let's talk about the classes that we are going to create. We are going to have a main entity class. So this entity class is going to contain everything that every single entity needs, like a position on a screen and maybe a texture. Now we are also going to create a few subclasses. So we are going to create maybe a creature class, and this creature class is going to extend the enemy class, or I'm sorry, the entity class. Now, all of our creatures in our game, a creature would be something like our player, or say maybe like a slime enemy, is going to extend the creature class. Then we're also going to have a few more subclasses of the entity class, so maybe like an item class. So an item class is going to extend the entity class, and then every item is going to extend the item class, such as maybe an arrow. And of course we can go on and on with this. This is just a basic example. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a main entity class that's going to hold everything that every entity has in common. We're then going to create a few subclasses that extend the entity class, like a creature class and maybe an item class. They're going to add a few things, so everything that creatures have in common and everything that items have in common. All items are going to extend the item class. All creatures, like a player or a slime, are going to extend the creature class. So it's going to work something like that. So what we need to do is we need to create an entity class, we need to create a creature class, and then we can finally create our player class. So it's a tiny bit more complicated, but this is the way to do it properly. So that's what we're going to do. So I real quickly recreated this diagram to provide a bit more information. So we know that we have 3 classes that we need to make in order to get the player. We need an entity class, we need a creature class that extends the entity class, and we need our player class, which is going to extend the creature class. Now, what does every single entity need? What does the entity class need to have? Well, every single entity is going to have a position on the screen, an x and y coordinate to be drawn to on the screen. Every single entity is also going to need a tick method so that it can update all of its variables, as well as a render method so it can draw itself to the screen. Next, we have our creature class. Now, the only thing that creatures are going to have for now is going to be, say, health. So the amount of health, the amount of life that every creature is going to have. Then we have our player class. The player class is just going to contain a texture or an image of the player, as well as be able to get user input so that we can move it around. Now if we look here, since our player class extends the creature class, our player is going to have not only a texture and an input, it's also going to have health. And since the creature class extends the entity class, our player will also have a position on the screen, an x and y coordinate, a tick method that it can use, and a render method that it can use. So you'll see that this process of extending a bunch of these classes is going to help us out a lot. And again, you're going to get this in no time, I promise you. Now, I'm really sorry guys that we didn't get to any programming in this tutorial, but I just felt that it was important to get these diagrams to you so that we can understand the process of how we're going to create our player. And even if you're not sure that you fully understand this, that's completely fine. Move on to the next video and we'll begin programming, and hopefully you'll begin to understand it slowly as we begin to program it. Again guys, I'm really sorry that we didn't do any programming in this tutorial, but the next tutorial is going to be a lot of programming and a lot of fun. Thanks for watching everyone, and I'll see you in the next tutorial.